Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to see all of you here. I'm Vijay Kumar, I'm the Dean of the school, and it's my pleasure and honor to welcome you to the 21st Heilmeier Award Lecture. This lecture is named after George H. Heilmeier, and it recognizes our George H. Heilmeier Faculty Award of Excellence. This was established in 2001. And this is the premier research award in the school. Actually, it's the only research award in the school that recognizes excellence in research. It's named after George Heilmeier, who graduated in 1958 with a degree in electrical engineering. After completing his undergraduate studies at Penn, he went on to graduate school at Princeton. Dr. Heilmeier went on to receive international recognition for the discovery of several new electro-optic effects in liquid crystals, which led to the development of the first LCD displays for watches. And of course, for calculators, instruments, and some of which we still use today. He was the winner of the 1991 National Medal of Science, the 1997 IEEE Medal of Honor, and many awards. These are the two most significant in his portfolio. And he held 15 patents. Most famously, he was also the director of DARPA, Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, and he gave DARPA much of the flavor today that we see taking high-risk, high-payoff bets in federally funded research. The award in his name recognizes his extraordinary research career, his leadership in tech innovation and public service, and of course, his loyal and steadfast support of Penn Engineering. Over 2 decades, the list of Heilmeier Award winners has grown to include many accomplished members of our faculty. And if we had a Penn Engineering Faculty Hall of Fame, this is it. Some of the inductees into our Hall of Fame include Raymond Gordy, Dennis Disher, Dan Hammer, Michael Kearns, Dawn Bonnell, Pedro Ponte Castaneda, Naranguera, Scott Diamond, Rajiv Allure, Karen Winey, John Vose, George Pappas, Shu Yang, Dan Kodicek, Vivek Shenoy, Dan Roth, and Ritesh Agarwal. It's now my pleasure to invite Ravi Radhakrishnan, Professor and Chair of Bioengineering, to introduce the latest inductee to our Hall of Fame. Ravi?
Thank you, Dean Kumar. Welcome all. It's my very great pleasure to have you all here for the Heilmeier Award lecture today. I'm here to introduce Dani Bassett, who is currently the J. Peter Skirkanich Professor of University of Pennsylvania in the Department of Bioengineering. They also hold affiliations in the Department of Physics and Astronomy, Electrical and Systems Engineering, Neurology and Psychiatry, and are a member of the Santa Fe Institute. Dani received their bachelor's degree from the Schreier's Honors College in physics with a minor in mathematics from Pennsylvania State University. And then they went on to go to Cambridge in the UK to receive a PhD, a doctoral degree in physics, and then did a postdoctoral fellowship also in physics at the University of California in Santa Barbara. Dr. Smith Bassett is a very prolific scientific researcher with over 400 publications, cited over 43,000 times with an H index of 97. They are among an elite group of scientists who are in the top 1% of the most noted cited researchers consistently every year over the past 5 years. Dani is a fellow of the American Physical Society, a fellow of the American Institute for Medical and Biological Engineers, Penn Fellow. They have received numerous awards, notably the MacArthur Award, the National Science Foundation's Career Award, and the Erdos Rennie Prize in Network Science in Mathematics, among many honors. They are currently the co-chair of the LGBTQ+ faculty working group at Penn, and the chair of the DEI committee in bioengineering. Dani Bassett Smith is widely regarded as the founding parent of the field of network neuroscience, or sometimes it's called neuroconnectomics. So I'm going to share, so in academia, we have this obsession with the number three. So for example, when we apply for jobs, we are asked to provide 3 letters of references. When we write a proposal, we are asked to write 3 specific aims. When we submit a paper, we oftentimes receive like 3 reviews in the form of critiques. So when we nominated Dani for this award, which is for the network approach to complexity, we had indicated 3 fields, one in neuroscience, in psychiatry, but also in the field of non-equilibrium thermodynamics of granular materials. And of course, the committee promptly wrote back saying, unfortunately, there's only 1 Heilmeier award to give away and not 3. And so we focused our attention on the theme of structure, function, and control of brain networks, which kind of supersedes a lot of what Dani does for their research. But still, I thought that I'll summarize very briefly Dani's contributions in triads. A sample of the last 3 papers from Dani's lab in the past 3 years, the physics of brain network structure, control, and function, the dynamic reconfiguration of the brain networks, and topological data analysis for the network neuroscientists have collectively been cited over 1,000 times just in the last 3 years. Their recent effort in outreach led them to emphasize 3 aspects of science literacy, being science advocacy, science activism, and science DEI. Finally, in their most recent book titled The Curious Minds, Dani, along with their co-author Perry Zern, who also happens to be Dani's twin, they identified 3 styles of curiosity. The busybody who collects stories, creating loose knowledge networks, the hunter who hunts down secrets or discoveries, creating tight networks, and the dancer who takes leaps of creative imagination, creating loopy ones. And anecdotally, when I went through this room talking to people, what I realized is a lot of us are here because we are curious about what Dani is going to talk about, which is on curiosity. So it's my distinct pleasure to invite Dani Bassett Smith to the podium to deliver her Heilmeier Award lecture.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that introduction. I'm excited to tell you all today about what we've been thinking about in the context of curiosity. So over the next few minutes, I will be separating my remarks into 4 sections. I'll first ask the very basic question: what is curiosity? After I do that, I'd like to move into what are the styles of curiosity? And then how might those styles relate to theories, both from psychology and from philosophy? Finally, in the end, I would like to expand my view to include how curiosity can address societal questions. The organization of the talk or the subsections will differ in their content. The first one is very intuitive, has a lot of graphics. I'm trying to focus on just communicating some of the ideas. The next 2 include a sort of deeper dive into philosophy and science, and the last one comes out into social justice. So first, what is curiosity? When I say that term, you may each have different things that come into mind. One that is very common is the love of trivia. Sometimes we think about someone who's curious as someone who just wants lots of pieces of information, including lots of pieces of trivia. But you might also think of a toddler asking an unending string of questions. That's a really nice picture of curiosity. Or you might think of students in a classroom raising their hands to ask questions. These are all different pictures of what curiosity might mean to you, or you may have other pictures in your mind. But what I would also like to do is to suggest that these are only 3 phenotypes, and there are many, many more that we could want to understand. The reason that these are not enough is that there are many people who are curious who dislike trivia. They're curious in a very different way. There are also many people who are curious who don't ask questions out loud, verbally. And there are lots of people who sit in the back and don't raise their hand. in the context of a classroom. And that can be for lots of reasons. It can be for reasons of neurodiversity. It can be for reasons of personality. Perhaps they're shy or introverted. So it's important, I think, to ask, what are ways of thinking about curiosity that are not specific to one phenotype of a person? That question of asking what curiosity is in this very broad way is something that people have been asking for millennia. So we can go back, for example, to St. Augustine, who suggests in 397 or writes in 397 that curiosity is a lust to experience or find out. Thomas Aquinas in 1270 writes that curiosity is the desire to know. Descartes in 1649 suggests that curiosity is a desire to understand. John Locke in 1693 suggests that curiosity is an appetite after knowledge. And we can continue on into William James, John Dewey, Voss, George Lowenstein, and then finally Celeste Kidd in 2015 suggests that curiosity is a drive state for information. So what I want to ask today is, what is it that we are desirous of? What is that thing? So we have experience, we have knowledge, we have understanding, we have better cognition. What is that thing? And I want to suggest that there's a strong distinction between searching for bits of information and searching for knowledge. And in particular, I think that the distinction lies in how pieces of information are connected to one another, and therefore that we are curious in a way that is connective, where we want to bring one piece of information to another piece of information. Now, this idea that knowledge has a network or connective phenotype is something that many people over the last several decades have thought about. And I like to quote this passage from Henri Poincaré's Science and Hypothesis, where he writes that the aim of science is not things themselves, as the dogmatists in their simplicity imagine, but the relations among things. Outside these relations, there's no reality knowable. So what he's underscoring here is that knowledge, and particularly scientific knowledge, is about the relations between pieces of information. That idea is not just something that Poincaré suggested, it's also present in a lot of writing from philosophers and scientists in the past many decades. So I want to ask, if knowledge is a connective object, then how do we engage curiously with it? How do we acquire that knowledge? That drives us to suggest a connectional account of curiosity, where perhaps we begin with a current idea, and that's this idea in gray, and then we search for information that is related, ideas that are either very nearby, or a little bit farther away, or even farther away. And it's important to think through the distances of our curiosity. Am I curious about something that's nearby to what I already know, or am I most driven by curiosity to something drastically different than anything I've ever heard? That differs across each of us. We may each have different preferences for nearby curiosity or more distant curiosity. But we also differ a lot in what we do with that information. So for example, some of us may prefer to gather those pieces of information a little bit more like trivia, whereas others of us may gather a piece of information and want to connect it to what we already know. So we're driven to create this hub and spoke architecture of our knowledge. Still, others of us may not like just that hub and spoke architecture. We really want to understand how the new pieces of information out here on the edge are connected to one another too. So that sort of person wants to build web-like architectures of knowledge. What that means is that we can each have different topological signatures to our curiosity. And by topology, I mean the shape of the connective architecture or the pattern of connections. So these four different pictures here are four people. I know they don't look like people, but these are four different people. The person on the left-hand side is a person who loves to connect information in a triangular grid. So they really want to know how each piece of information is related to the other pieces of information nearby. This is someone who might say, I want all of the details and I want to fit them into my body of knowledge. This person, in contrast, is one that doesn't mind having some pieces of information disconnected or not knowing how everything matches what you already know. So a little bit of uncertainty, a little bit of missing knowledge is fine with this person. This person also doesn't mind huge gaps in understanding, and this one loves gaps in understanding. This is the person who says, spare me the details, I just want to get the gist. So when we think about how we each create those kinds of architectures in our minds, we have to start thinking about the dynamics of curiosity. Where did the mind start, and then where did it go over time? Here's an example of one particular connective style. So on the left-hand side, what you see is an initial moment in time where there's a structure of understanding between pieces of knowledge. Then this person sees a new idea far away. This is one of the people who really likes distant ideas. So they like really new ideas, but then what they want to do is to figure out how that idea relates to what they already know. So they'll build backward from the new idea to what is currently existing in their knowledge structure. So that's one example of how these networks can be built, but there are others. For example, this middle person here will build in a way that's very consistent with the way they've built previously. So they'll add on another piece of knowledge in a way that's structured exactly like the previous information that they had. We'll just keep building over time. And then this third person is different still. So they may jump to a new area of knowledge and then fill out that knowledge space a little bit, and then jump again, and then fill out a little bit. So they'll get sort of a clustered-like structure as they jump from area of knowledge to area of knowledge. What that means sort of more concretely in terms of the modeling and in terms of understanding the structure of knowledge is that we can think about individual concepts as having locations, a coordinate in an n-dimensional knowledge space where n is the number of concepts, or the number of independent meanings. Then what curiosity does is that it allows us to move from one concept to another concept. And as we do that, we lay down an edge or a relation or a connection between those two concepts. That then allows us to think through how we walk through knowledge spaces and whether and how we may walk through those knowledge spaces differently. So I would like to now ask, what is curiosity's walk and how does it move? That brings me to the second section, styles of curiosity. To ask how curiosity walks, how does the mind move as we are curious? We collaborated with Perry Zern, who's in the Department of Philosophy at American University, who was very interested in seeking the styles of curiosity that are evident in literary and philosophical works over the last 2 millennia. He focused on the Western intellectual tradition, so I want to highlight the fact that other curiosity styles are likely to be present in other intellectual traditions, so just keep in mind this is just in the Western intellectual tradition. He focused on works that were written in Greek, in Latin, in French, in German, and in English. And he focused both on words for curiosity, but also synonymous phrases and interrogative sentences. And in doing that, he excavated 3 particular styles of curiosity, and those are the ones that Robbie was mentioning earlier. To give you a little bit of a flavor for what these styles are like, I pulled out example passages from this prior literature so that you can get a feel for the different people. So the busybody, also referred to as the butterfly sometimes, is one that's very evident in Plutarch's On Curiosity, where he writes, and the busybody, shunning the country as something stale and uninteresting and undramatic, pushes into the bazaar and the marketplace and the harbors asking, is there any news? And then in Martin Heidegger's Being in Time, he writes that curiosity is the not staying with what is nearest, or the distraction by new possibilities, or the never dwelling anywhere. So this person is somebody who really doesn't care what the information is, just wants all of it. This is perhaps today somebody who has 100 tabs open on their computer and loves just all of that information. Okay. That's different from the hunter. So the hunter style is also present in this literature for the last 2 millennia. And we can go back to Plutarch again, where he says, if you have to be curious, I mean, he argues that you shouldn't be, because there's all kinds of problems with being curious, which we can get into later over the food. But if you have to be curious, don't turn aside and follow every scent, but keep your sense of smell pure and untainted for its proper task. And then Nietzsche, in Beyond Good and Evil, writes that the man of curiosity wishes he had a few hundred helpers and good, well-trained hounds that he could drive into the history of the human soul to round its game. And then Jacques Derrida, in The Animal That Therefore I Am, writes that to be curious is to track, to sniff, to trail, and to follow some of the reasons for the so confident usage of words. So across these 3 examples, what you can see is that there's a hunter style of curiosity that differs markedly from the busybody. This is somebody who is searching, who is following a trail, who is sniffing, who is tracking, who has a particular direction that they're aiming in. And that style is different yet from the third, which is the dancer. There are 2 passages I wanted to read for this one. The first one is again from Nietzsche, but now in his Gay Science, where he's describing thinkers of the future. What would a thinker of the future be like? And he says, we do not belong to those who have ideas only among books or when stimulated by books. It is our habit to think outdoors, walking, leaping, climbing, dancing, preferably on lonely mountains or near the sea where even the trails become thoughtful. Our first questions about the value of a book, of a human being, or a musical composition are, can they walk even more, can they dance? And that's not in the physical sense, that is in the sort of intellectual sense. And then Michel Foucault, in The Masked Philosopher, writes that I can't help but dream about a kind of criticism that would try not to judge, but to bring an avoir, a book, a sentence, an idea to life. It would light fires, watch the grass grow, listen to the wind, and catch the sea foam in the breeze and scatter it. It would multiply not judgments, but signs of existence. It would summon them, drag them from their sleep. Perhaps it would invent them sometimes, all the better. I'd like criticism of scintillating leaps of the imagination. I dream of a new age of curiosity. So this style is quite different. This is someone who is leaping between ideas, who has imagination, has creativity, and is building something new and different. So these three styles then are present in the philosophical literature. However, for us as scientists and engineers, we're really interested in understanding whether those styles of curiosity are alive and well today, and if so, how is it that we can measure them and understand them? So to answer this question, we collaborated with David Leiden-Staley, who's a professor in the Annenberg School of Communication here at Penn. And he was interested in testing these three styles by using a task where participants are invited to browse Wikipedia for an extended period of time such that we can watch how they walk through the space of ideas. So in this study, there were 149 participants and over 5 hours of browsing data for each participant. So they were browsing for 15 minutes a day for 21 days. Collectively, over the entire sample, there were over 18,000 pages visited. Now you might want to know, how is it that we can understand the connective style of curiosity from Wikipedia browsing? One thing that we can do is that we can study every web page and calculate the semantic similarity between the two web pages. We can do that using natural language processing techniques. And in particular, we use serum frequency inverse document frequency, or TF-IDF, which allows you to assess similarities in the semantic context of any two pages. By using that approach, we can understand each person as walking differently through knowledge space. On the left-hand side, you see 3 different people. So here, for example, is one person, and the cosine similarity between the 2 pages that they walk between is relatively low. So this is somebody who's moving from one Wikipedia page to another that's drastically different. So a Wikipedia page on rhododendrons, the plant, to a page on the late Queen of England. In contrast, there's a person over here on the right-hand side who has cosine similarity values that are much higher, closer to 1. That means that this person is focusing on information that is connective, that is similar. For example, reading for all 21 days about the royal family, which is one thing that one of our participants did. In addition, so once we have that structure, then we can ask, well, which people are the busybodies and which people are the hunters? How can we map this kind of information to these styles from the philosophical literature? One way that we can do that is by focusing on the connective fingerprint. So here is an image of the hunter who is gathering connected pieces of information and therefore building a network that has relatively high clustering, meaning that they're filling in the triangles of knowledge space. In contrast, the busybody is going to be moving from one page to another that's very distinct and not connective. And so they're going to be building networks that have relatively low clustering. Now, our last hypothesis in this space related to individual personalities. Each of us have tendencies for what's called deprivation sensitivity. So that means that we are sensitive to being deprived of information. When we know that we're missing a piece of information, we may feel bad about that. We don't like it. It may cause us anxiety. It may cause us some negative feelings. And so there's a measure from psychology called deprivation sensitivity that we can acquire or measure from individual people to see where they sit on this personality trait. So here's an initial piece of data where you can see along the y-axis is the clustering coefficient of the networks that people are building as they browse. So that's how connective their architectures are. And then along the x-axis is the deprivation sensitivity of these individuals. What you can see is a positive relationship between these two features, such that people who feel a sense of deprivation when they are missing information are those who build networks with relatively high clustering coefficients. So they want to fill in all of those gaps. In contrast, those individuals who are very low on deprivation sensitivity really don't mind missing information. They build networks that have relatively low clustering coefficients. So they're moving from here to there and not necessarily filling anything in. So what you can see is that the busybody is going to be more on the left-hand side, hunter is going to be more on the right-hand side, but note that there's a lot of individual variation and some people are right in the middle. So we don't find bins of people or categories of people. We find a continuum whereby we vary in this domain. Now, importantly, we build differently, not just in terms of whether we're more busybody-like or more hunter-like, but we also build differently at various timescales. So we studied, for example, from week to week, and separate the data into early, middle, and late browsing, that participants are browsing differently each week, even though they may have a tendency towards one of these phenotypes or the other. And in particular, what we found is that days of greater sensation seeking, so we vary every day in how much we're seeking new sensations, days of greater sensation seeking than normal were days in which participants built more like busybodies. We also found relationships with variations that differ on longer timescales. So, for example, individuals with greater subclinical levels of depression tended to build networks with shorter steps. Now, I want to underscore the fact that busybodies, hunters, and dancers are not the only styles. I already mentioned that those are drawn from the Western intellectual tradition. But if you think about building with shorter steps or longer steps, more or fewer triangles, looping in various ways, then you can expand the repertoire of styles to include all kinds of beings. And we're very interested in studying how different animals exhibit curiosity and how the kinds of networks that they are building may be distinct from some or similar to some that humans are building. So that brings me to how these styles relate to psychological theories of curiosity. Might each theory align with a different style, or do we mix and match? And so that's this third section. Here, what I want to do is to say, what are some of the really common theories of curiosity, and can we operationalize them with this connective language? The first common theory of curiosity from psychology is called the information gap theory. This views curiosity as the drive to obtain information that's missing from a mental model of the world. So this is somebody who's much more, like the hunter. There's also another common theory is the compression progress theory. So this views curiosity as a drive to obtain information that improves the compression of a mental model and thereby lowers its cost of representation in the mind. The third and final theory is one that we developed here. It's called the conformational change theory. It views information-seeking behavior as resulting in the creation of an expansive knowledge network that's embedded in a conceptual geometry and allows for shape-shifting or conformation, changes in the shape of our knowledge as we gain a new piece of information or as we delete a piece of information from our mental space. What are the mental affordances of these three theories? Well, the first one, if you're going to fill all of the gaps, you're going to build networks that have relatively high density, but you may also experience high levels of cognitive rigidity because you haven't left anything open or left room for uncertainty or ambiguity or vagueness. You may tend to have knowledge structures that you use in a relatively rigid way. By contrast, the conformational change theory, which suggests that we build in order to allow these shape changes, allows us to build networks that have relatively low density and less cognitive rigidity associated with it. But there is a cost of representing this kind of network in our mind. It's not so easy to compress. There's a lot of complexity there that can't be compressed. How do we quantify these three theories? Well, I'm not going to go into the details, but for the information gap theory, we study the gaps using applied algebraic topology to calculate Betty numbers. For compression progress theory, we use information theory to calculate network compressibility. And for the conformational change theory, we use mechanics, actually, to calculate the conformational degrees of freedom of the networks that people are building. The data that we use to test the three theories is the same data that I've described already. So people are walking through Wikipedia, and as they do so, we are capturing that information and understanding how they're filling in the gaps. So what does the data say? First, regarding the information gap theory, Along the y-axis here is the number of gaps that are zero-dimensional. What you can see in green is the information from humans, and in purple is from a null model that's a statistical correlate. And what you can observe is that people are building networks with fewer zero-dimensional gaps than expected in a null model. That means that they are filling gaps, and that therefore information gap theory is consistent with what we see in humans. That's also true if we look at one-dimensional gaps. However, if we look at two-dimensional gaps, which are structured like this beautiful tetrahedron here, what we see is that individuals here in blue are building networks that have many more large gaps than expected in the null model. So that's interesting. Why are we leaving? Why are we humans leaving these large gaps inside of our knowledge structure? That suggests that the information gap theory is not enough to explain what humans are doing. It is certainly doing well in the lower dimensional gaps, 0 and 1 dimensions, but not in 2 dimensions. So that suggests we need something more. Well, let's check the compression progress theory. So here what you see in red is the compressibility of the networks that participants are building, and then in purple is what's expected in the null model. So you can see that participants are building networks with very high compressibility, consistent with compression progress theory. What we're building are networks that are highly compressible and therefore have a low cost of representation. The final theory was conformational change theory, building in a way that allows for conformations or shape changes. And here, what we can see in pink is the humans, and then purple is the null model. We can see that participants are building networks with greater degrees of freedom, conformational degrees of freedom, than expected in the null model. So that's consistent with this suggestion that we're building so that we can shape change. So now we have 3 theories, and we have a little bit of evidence for all of them. Let's summarize that very briefly. So here we have evidence for the information gap theory in 0 and 1 dimensions, but not 2 dimensions. We have evidence for compression progress theory and evidence for conformational change theory. Now, as a scientist, I probably did want one of these theories to come out as a clear winner, but that's not actually true with what we see from the data. So perhaps we can ask, what does this combination of drivers or mechanisms afford humans? Well, it affords a balance between cognitive rigidity and cognitive flexibility if both mechanisms are driving us. It also provides us perhaps with a balance between costly and cheap mental representations. So when we have these different mechanisms driving our curiosity, that allows us to build in a way that balances affordances that we might need. So now in this just sort of last few minutes, what I'd like to do is to take this connective notion of curiosity and expand it out to ask how it can help us to think through existing societal questions. And to do that, what I'd like to say is that when we think about curiosity as fundamentally connective, I think we can turn to these societal questions with a new approach, and that is that we can use an interdisciplinary approach that foregrounds a critical consciousness. And by critical consciousness, what I mean is that we ask questions about why we are connecting in a particular way, not in the sense of constantly critiquing in a negative fashion, but asking, questioning, openly addressing whether the ways that we are using and understanding curiosity are helpful in the world. So in answering that question, how can we turn a critical lens to our practice of curiosity? I have 4 very brief answers to suggest. The first one is practicing a connectional curiosity. So if we are practicing a connectional curiosity, how can we do that with a critical consciousness? Well, we can ask, are there some conceptual steps that we refuse to walk? And if so, why? Are there some bits of knowledge that we do not value in connecting? Are there some sorts of knowledge that we subjugate and others that we laud? And if so, why is that? What histories and structures of oppression have influenced our practices? The way that we have been investigating those questions is in the context of citation ethics. How do we curiously engage with the ideas from other scholars? And how do we connect to their ideas in a way that hopefully foregrounds this critical consciousness? To address that question, we've studied citation trails by looking at the reference lists of papers and studying those reference lists as a curious walk from idea to idea to idea. What we've found, and others have found across the world at this point, is that there is a injustice that is occurring whereby ideas from marginalized scholars are being underrepresented in reference lists and under-engaged as connectional interlocutors. So I want to ask, in the face of that data, how do we develop resistant practices of engaging with the ideas of scholars from marginalized genders, races, ethnicities, and other demographic factors? But the second answer to how can we turn a critical lens to our practice of curiosity is by actively practicing an interdisciplinary curiosity. So I want to ask, how can we see and value the distinct curiosity styles that are present in different disciplines? How can we appreciate the diverse knowledge structures that those distinct styles build? When I think about linear algebra, for example, I think about a knowledge space that is highly ordered, that is densely connected, that is very, very structured in a methodical way. By contrast, when I think about bioengineering, I think there are whole spaces of bioengineering where we don't know the answers, we don't know what to do next, and we don't even know how to connect these small subfields together with one another. In part, that's because the field is so young, and those gaps are really exciting. There are places where we can build, where we can expand, and create different knowledge structures. I also want to throw out the idea of history as one that allows us to build more tendril-like structures as we work through understanding the event trajectories that led us to this place and this time in history. And as we understand and come to understand the different architectural styles of different disciplines, we can ask, how have these disciplines been structured by a specific set of thinkers and historically developed systems of thought? And then as we answer that, we can ask, how can they be restructured or unstructured or structured differently? The third way that we can turn a critical lens to our practice of curiosity is by modeling, teaching, and supporting diverse curiosities. How can we do that? Well, we can ask, are there some questions that we hold as the right sorts of questions? And if so, need they be? Do we model for our students, for other people in our lives, asking diverse sets of questions? Do we question the world as it is and help students to see how to imagine a new world of tomorrow? Do we see and equally value the hunters, the busybodies, and the dancers in our classrooms? Or is there one style that we consistently value more than the others? Do we see and equally value other kinds of curiosities? I've put squirrel and tree curiosities here, but you could put whatever your favorite style is, just to underscore that the three styles I talked about before are not the only ones. And lastly, do we seek to understand neuroatypical curiosities in the classroom and provide ways for those curiosities to flourish? Final point, how can we turn a critical lens to our practice of curiosity? We can do that by engaging in ethical curiosity. Sometimes we may think about curiosity as always a good. It's always good to be curious. But I want to challenge that, and many thinkers are challenging that and asking, is there a way for us to engage our curiosity that is ethical? So to address that question, I'm going to pull some work again from Perry Zern from the Philosophy Compass, where he asks, with whom do we query? Where do we query? And how do we query? And is there a way for us to answer those questions differently as we pursue an ethical curiosity? There are two kinds of formations of curiosity that are problematic from an ethical perspective, and I want to ask whether and how they exist in the practices of science and engineering. The first one is the spectacle erasure curiosity formation, which is that by which someone spectacularizes an object or a person or a field of study or a thinker or a theory, but simultaneously erases its history, its multiplicity, and its relational depth. This is a practice of curiosity that is ethically compromised. The second type is the access disclosure curiosity formation, by which someone assumes total access to the other, but simultaneously demands the other's disclosure. This sometimes happens when we ask questions about things that we don't need to know the answer to. So for example, a faculty member like me, if a student approaches me and says that I need accommodations to Y and Z, I have a responsibility not to ask invasive questions like, what is your diagnosis? Or how long have you had this? Or et cetera. But just to say, let's work through the appropriate channels and with kindness and openness and allow you opacity in your experience. We don't actually need to know the answers to many of those questions to provide accommodation. So how might these unethical curiosity formations show up in our work, in our engagement with the natural world, with our collaborators and our students? So with that, this is where I sort of wanted to get to by the end of this afternoon's discussion. And I also wanted to highlight the people who were important in the specific studies that I showed you today. On the left-hand side, I'm showing you the people who led and participated in the initial study of the Wikipedia data set, and that was David Lyden-Stanley, Perry, but also Dale Zoe, who's a graduate student in neuroscience, and Ann Blevins, who was a postdoc at the time. For the second study addressing psychological theories of curiosity, that was led by Shankar Patenkar, who's a grad student in BE here, in collaboration with Jason Kim in BE, Chris Lin, who was in physics, and with Matthew, who's a grad student in ESE. So with that, thank you so much for listening.
We have time for some questions? Please.
Could you go over again what was the difference between the 0-dimensional, 1-dimensional, and 2-dimensional gaps? Knowledge?
Yeah. Absolutely. So the question was, can I repeat the distinction between the 0, 1-dimensional, and 2-dimensional gaps? So a 0-dimensional gap is present when you have disconnected components in the network. So if there are two components of the network and no connections between them, that's a 0-dimensional gap.
So what does that look like from the Wikipedia sense? Like an example of that?
An example of that would be using, so not the hyperlinks for example, but the search bar.
Gotcha.
On the same topic, do these different informational or curiosity theories describe different modalities? Do they correlate or are they?
They describe different modalities. I think I need a little.
If the information gap theory was, say, the only one that described curiosity, would that provide credence to the busybodies? Or
Oh, yeah, that's a really good question. The question is, when we think about these three different theories of curiosity, are there some of them that would predict that all humans would be busybodies or all humans would be hunters? Yeah, it's a really great question. So the information gap theory, at least as operationalized in this connected phenotype, the way we've done it, would predict that most people would be hunters because they're constantly going to be filling and not creating the gaps, right? That's more of the busybody type person. None of these predict that everyone will be a busybody, but the information gap one would predict that there would be more hunters than not.
While you have the slide up, so those three you presented, sorry.
Yeah.
You presented them as being different, but there probably are high correlations between them. Is there mathematically a necessary correlation or any of them anti-correlated? I mean, how much should I do these as parallel descriptions of the same thing or as antithetical to each other?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I've separated them just because historically they've been separated, but not because mathematically they need to be. I think that the cognitive driver is different for each. So the information gap theory is going to be driven by this deprivation sensitivity. Compression progress theory is more about building something that is helpful in sort of engaging in the future. So building models that are compressible and you can take forward with you in time simply with when you have limited mental resources. And that's quite different than being driven by a sense of deprivation.
But if you optimize information gap, presumably that would increase compression as well, or no?
Yes. Yeah, it would. Yes, but I would say that, but the sort of suggested mechanism is different. Yeah.
Yeah, you can't pick up a newspaper these days without reading about artificial intelligence. Is there any, can you interact between curiosity and artificial intelligence?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a lot of interest in building. Oh, sorry. So to repeat the question, what is the relationship, or can you interact AI and curiosity? So there's a lot of interest in building artificial agents that display curious practices, right? Or some people would say display curiosity, but I like to say display curious practices. So you can certainly build artificial agents that would seek information and connect information in a variety of ways. One thing that I see as a really neat opportunity in the field right now is to bring these various connective styles to the artificial intelligence space to create agents that are building in really different ways, and then ask how is it that those different styles of curiosity could support different tasks that the AI is meant to perform.
Thank you. So I was always told there's no such thing as a bad question, but now you raised this question about good curiosity and bad curiosity. So I'm careful what I ask. But I guess my question to you is, when you talk about the conformational change model within a set of theories that you're considering, is there an obvious relationship between conformational change and how our own methods to store information evolves as we go from, say, babies to toddlers to adults to adults? Is there anything? Is this related to brain development in some way?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the question is the sort of pursuing of networks that have conformational change something that differs across development, so from babies to kids to adults and later age? That's a really interesting question, and we don't have a direct answer to it yet. There are differences in styles of curiosity as kids develop, but we haven't yet explicitly linked that to conformational change. But maybe one way that I'd like to address the question is that I think that if we engage in living in a way that has this critical consciousness, always asking whether the knowledge that we think that we have is right, or the assumptions that we have made for much of our lives are accurate, or associations that we may have that are subconscious and biased in a variety of ways. If we're constantly questioning that, then we will end up removing pieces from our network over time, and that will allow shape changes, or opening our minds and changing how we engage with the world in a way that's more just and more ethical. So I do think that particular mechanism is consistent with a long-term scale of living critically.
Do you have a sense of what collective curiosity feels like? If this, all of this is spoken to the individual top fingerprint, but if we're collectively curious or we're in some type of collective setting, does that change our topological fingerprint, or is there some emergent phenomenon that comes about in curiosity when there are more than two individuals interacting?
Yeah, that's a really good question. We do have a study of collective curiosity, particularly in the context of science. So how has scientific knowledge been built over the last 2 millennia? And is that collective practice something that creates knowledge networks of certain kinds? And we can also distinguish between that sort of collective structure in scientific concepts versus in concepts in humanities. I'm happy to, we can chat later. We can send you.
These three different styles of curiosity, it seems like differences. There is attention. So in this like Wikipedia experience, if you instead of just like anything, do you suspect that people maybe look like these bodies shit?
That's a really great question. So the question was, it seems like the hunter has a lot of intentionality, and maybe the other ones don't. And so then if you were to give participants a goal, would they all end up looking like hunters for certain hunters? I think that's a really interesting question. I guess I'm going to answer it personally. I personally feel much more like a busybody in the way that I read books, the way that I choose the books that I read, and move from book to book, space of knowledge to another space of knowledge outside of my research practice. And I would say that is quite intentional. The reason that I move from one idea space to another is because I want to broaden my mind in really unexpected ways. So I purposely choose wildly different books so that I won't be surprised there'll be a lot of unexpected ideas or connections that can occur. So I do, for me, it definitely feels intentional. Maybe the way that I would frame your question is, or think about your question implementing it is, what kind of goal do you give somebody or ask of somebody? Is the goal opening a new mind or finding new and surprising things, or is the goal finding a particular piece of information that solves this particular puzzle? So maybe it's the nature of the goal that would differ across those types.
In the back.
A biological. So the question is there a biological explanation for depression? Compression. Oh, there is a cognitive argument for it, which is that we want to minimize, we want to build models of the world that are accurate while minimizing computational resources. And that would be something that would drive some kinds.
One last question.
Thank you for the very nice talk. I was wondering if you could give an example of the spectacle erasure process which you're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. So for the spectacle erasure formation of curiosity, an example would be the freak shows of early America, for example, right? So that is a place where there were individuals who were referred to as freaks, and obviously we want to trouble that terminology. But historically, that's what they were called, and the idea was you will be curious about these different humans, these different beings, these different animals, and in doing that, by engaging in that style of curiosity, the personhood, the humanity, history of that individual was erased.
Dani, thank you very much.
Thank you.